Hello, it is my pleasure to present to you the Spanish translation and statistical validation of the virtual reality presence and immersion surveys. I am Assistant Professor Yolanda Tromp. We are a team of researchers from the University of Granada in Spain, and we are collaborating on a grant awarded to us by the Spanish Minister of Science and Innovation to evaluate the use of VR for hazard perception and risk-taking. And the primary grant applicant is Professor Candy Castro. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to her by email, which will be provided at the end of this presentation. We want to know really if VR can be used instead of video to present hazard prediction assessment tests, because this could really facilitate and improve the testing and the time to create tests and to take tests. So that is our main mission. So now you have an idea of the background that gave occasion to the research that we are presenting here. And before I go into the presentation of our work, I want to define the outline. I will be talking about VR as a promising tool for psychology and training and education. VR is used for a neuropsychological evaluation and the creation of psychophysiological intervention programs, which means that we really need to know what the general capacity is for immersion in VR in terms of what people experience, but also the virtual environment itself. How immersive is it? And how immersive does it need to be to achieve its goals? So this is why we want to make sure we have validated tools, and I will be explaining the what, why and how of validation and how to achieve it, and the results of our own work on the translation validation of the immersion and presence questionnaires to the Spanish language. And at the end I will make some conclusions about the fact that it is incredibly valuable to have a global survey data pool of validated translations and results, so that we can benchmark the applications that we make and compare experiences of users and keep track of how users value and experience virtual worlds for these particular intervention programs. I want to briefly introduce to you the concepts of presence and immersion. So, the origin of presence in a virtual world originates by interacting with that virtual world. And you can see how in a normal world we start to build a model of ourselves and the world around us by interacting with it and getting feedback from it. And as long as this feedback is consistent, we perceive this as a reliable, understandable, explainable situation. But the moment the feedback doesn't behave the same way, we are alerted and hopefully adjust our motor commands, our movements, our responses, our physical reactions to the object in the virtual world or in the real world in order to adjust our responses to it and get done what we needed to do. So you can see how this works in the real world, and in the next slide you will see how this translates to the virtual world. So here you can see how by interacting with the virtual world in the virtual environment with the virtual body, the model of the real world and the real self is temporarily pushed to the background and replaced by an awareness and a model in our mind of the virtual world and the virtual self. And as long as that interaction is consistent and believable, that feedback loop remains in place, and the sense of presence, and with that a sense of being mentally or cognitively immersed in the virtual world, will occur. So this is where we want to make sure that when users interact with the virtual world, the feedback is understandable and their responses are easily executed on the virtual body or the virtual objects in the virtual world. And this will maintain a sense of being immersed in the virtual world, which is, practically speaking, what we really want to achieve if we want training and education to be really clear and memorable and easy to understand, without the interaction of the virtual world and the interface to the virtual world being a distraction in experiencing the actual experience that we want the user to have. Because this would also create a noise on our experimental measurements of the user's experience. And this is why we want to make sure the user is happily immersed and feeling in control and fully identified with the virtual self and the virtual body. There are questionnaires, surveys that have been developed specifically to measure the sense of presence and immersion in a virtual reality world. And these are self-reported questionnaires in the sense that we ask users after trying a virtual experience what it was like. And sometimes we measure their opinion before they try it and then also after they try it, so we can get some sense of their opinion and the changes in their opinion. And so the IPQ, the Igroup Presence Questionnaire, developed in 2001, measures the ability of the virtual environments to produce in people a sense of being in the virtual environment, a sense of presence and immersion. And vice versa, the ITQ, the Immersive Tendencies Questionnaire, developed in 1998, was developed to measure people's general proneness to feel immersed, to become immersed in VR, but this could also be in a story or in a movie, in a book. So these two are internationally used since they have been developed, and these are the ones to use for measuring presence and immersion. And the situation really is that those questionnaires are not translated to other languages or only a few. And it really is very kind of technical language to answer the questionnaires, and personal experiences that are better described in one's first language than in English or another language that is not their first language, because a lot of details of the emotional value, the quality of the experience may get lost in the translation. And obviously, for being able to understand people's experiences, it is incredibly important to have that kind of deep understanding of the information that you gather through experiments, especially because these are experiments with real people and they take a lot of time and they influence real people's lives. So we really want, as quick as possible, to know the best way and to achieve the results that we are aiming for. And you can see, for instance, here on the slide, that VR is used for phobia research and treatment of gambling disorders, nicotine dependence, cigarette cravings, and alcohol cravings, just to name a few. So this kind of gives you an idea of the urgency and the importance of getting a clear idea of the different levels of presence and immersion that are necessary and achievable by the different applications, and getting a better idea of what is necessary in terms of design of virtual worlds and virtual experiences to achieve what we want to achieve in terms of treatment, so that we can push down the costs of development and push up and maximize the effects of the treatment. In many ways, the opposite of the coin of the good experience of being immersed and feeling very present in a virtual environment is the feeling of nausea that can occur when movements are very brusque, very, very quick in a virtual world, especially if you're viewing a pre-recorded animation from the point of view of the user without having control over the movements. This can really create some quite intense nausea, and people are known to need a bucket to quickly come out of the virtual experience and throw up, and this is obviously something that we really want to avoid. And so this questionnaire was developed in 1993, and it really is still very much in use to have some kind of measure to control for simulator sickness during virtual experiences. Obviously, we need to make sure that the experience of the participant in the experiment is not influenced by feeling nauseous in any way. And also, when we design virtual worlds, we want to make sure that we control for any movements that could create the nausea or the worse symptoms, because that would make this game extremely unpopular. So that's why in terms of development and testing of learning and training and psychological intervention in VR, we always want to make sure that we know the degree of presence and immersion experienced by people, but also the degree of nausea and simulator sickness. And that's why this questionnaire has been extremely popular and is still very much used today, meaning that there is decades of data and a large body of reference material that can be used to compare different designs to see which ones are more nausea-inducing and which ones are less nausea-inducing. So that in itself becomes an incredibly valuable benchmark, if you like, that is a global need and it needs a global effort to create that kind of database. Standardization of a survey involves making sure the questions are reliable and valid. It means having the absolute minimum of questions that result in the maximum amount of information that we are interested in. So this is a process that psychometric psychologists are capable of doing by spending a lot of time whittling down the questions and refining the wording of the questions. And the reason why standardization is highly desirable is because it can then be generalized to the larger population. If it works again and again and it measures effectively for a smaller population, then we can start generalizing to the larger population, which is what we really want because we are trying to understand behavior and predict behavior. So we can then compare results across studies from different researchers across the world, which gives us more information about how VR is effective for the design and understanding of psychological tests or interventions, and vice versa, how psychological tests and interventions can help us understand how to design VR better. So this is why reliability, it measures again and again the same thing, and validity, it measures what we are interested in, and that and only that are important and parts that need to be achieved on a statistical level by doing empirical experiments. So very briefly, one more time, the effect of validity and reliability. Is it valid? Does it hit the mark, or is it off target? Is it reliable? Does it hit the mark again and again and again, or is it not really showing any patterns? And then valid and reliable is hitting the mark consistently. So this is a mnemonic for you to understand the difference and the importance of that. Moving on, here are the questionnaires that we used for our experiment. First of all, we are trying to compare the outcomes of the Immersive Tendencies Questionnaire and the Igroup Presence Questionnaire against the outcomes of the Inventory of Suggestibility developed by Gonzalez Ordi and Miguel Tobal in 1999, and the Simulator Sickness Questionnaire and the CREE, which is 4 questions consisting of a question about comfort, realism, immersion, and engagement. Also very much internationally used to help with design and understanding of experiments in VR and user experience questionnaire to gauge the effect of the user in the virtual environment and their user experience and user interaction with the environment. To summarize and be very specific, our aim in terms of translations, we have for the IPQ translations into French, German, Persian, Portuguese, and the German and Persian versions are also validated. and obtained acceptable validity. Additionally, the simulator sickness questionnaire was translated into Spanish, Portuguese, French, and German, and the inventory of suggestibility and the CREA questions were already written in Spanish. So the ITQ Immersive Tendencies Questionnaire, the proneness of people to become immersed in a virtual experience, looks like this. There are scales, and these are Likert scales. That's a technical name for this sliding scale of how much or how little someone experiences something, and they can add a score themselves, and in the middle is a neutral score. So there are 18 items on this questionnaire, and it measures three groups of experiences according to the researchers: the degree of involvement, the attentional focus that they experience normally for things, and the tendency to play video games. So the IPQ works similarly. The Igroup Presence Questionnaire, the ability of the virtual environment to produce in the people who experience it a sense of presence and immersion. So again, we're using these scales with questions for people to answer how much or how little they felt or experienced something, the Likert type response scales. In this case, there are 14 scales and 4 subscales, in the sense that the responses seem to group into experiences about spatial presence, involvement, so that's very much on the attention aspect of the experience. The realness, how realistic was it, and in terms of globally feeling there in general, a general sense of presence and immersion in the virtual world. The inventory of suggestibility was developed by Spanish-speaking researchers, so the original questions are in Spanish, and we have them in Spanish and English side by side. They are also organized as Likert type response scales, with statements that users have to reply to. There are 22 items, and they break down in 4 groups of themes seemingly important or similar to other surveys as well. Dreaming, fantasizing, the ability of a person to have daydreams. Absorption, how easily does somebody become involved in something. Emotional involvement, the ability to step in other people's shoes. And being influenced by others. So this is generally considered the inventory of suggestibility. We already discussed the Simulator Sickness Questionnaire by Kennedy and team, 1993, and we used the Spanish adaptation by Prieto and team in 2022, and this consists of 16 Likert type scale items and the breakdown of 3 dimensions: the oculomotor, the disorientation, and the nausea type symptoms. And finally, the CREA questionnaire, which has 4 questions in total, also on a Likert type scale, and these questions relate to the sense of comfort, realism, immersion, and engagement that the user experienced. And these are also translated into Spanish and side by side with the English. Our method is twofold: firstly the translation, and secondly the validation. The translation was done by committee design, and we had 2 native Spanish psychologist and a native English translator who took turns in checking and translating according to the committee by design method. Then we validated the translation with nearly 300 participants, nearly half and half male female, with obviously students and employees from the university on an average age of 23, nearly 23 years old. Our procedure for the experiment consisted of 3 phases: a pre-experimental phase, the experimental task itself, and a post-experimental phase. In the pre-experimental phase, the participants answer a number of questions about their background, and then they go through a task for 15 minutes. In our case, they were playing the Beat Saber game. If you have not played it, I recommend trying it out. It's exhilarating and a fitness type of game. Using the Meta Quest 2 headset, and then they were asked to answer a number of questionnaires again, including about any sensation of nausea and simulator sickness and how immersed they felt. Our data analysis method consists of several validation steps. First of all, we do the factorial validity, so we are checking for the internal factor structure of the questions within each questionnaire. And secondly, we are checking for internal consistency using McDonald's Omega. And third of all, we are using checking external validity, so the relationship between IPQ and ITQ and participants' socio-demographic variables. In this case, we are looking at differences between gender and educational background. And fourth of all, we are using a triangulation. We are checking the convergent and divergent validity of similar questionnaires, in this case suggestibility inventory, then the 4 create questions and the simulator sickness questionnaire, which we will explain in more detail further down the presentation. Our results add up with 4 levels of validation: the factorial validation, the internal consistency validation, the external validity, and the convergent and divergent validity. The ITQ factorial validity was found to have an acceptable goodness of fit, looking at the factorial structure and the loadings. The IPQ also obtained an acceptable goodness of fit. The internal consistency index, McDonald's Omega, was found to provide acceptable values. The third phase of our validation process was to check against external factors. So we are looking at gender differences, and what we found is that for men and women had a higher score on involvement and spatial presence compared to men, and a lower score on non-realness. These are interesting findings that could lead to further research, but we are not speculating here about these differences. We also checked the differences of experiencing presence and immersion for people with different educational backgrounds, and we did not find any significant results. And this could also be influenced by the fact that our population was mainly students, so that there was not a lot of age difference in our sample. And the fourth step in our validation process was to look at the relationship between the ITQ and IPQ factors using Pearson's correlation. And only 2 positive significant correlations were found between the ITQ involvement factor with the IPQ involvement factor and the spatial presence factor. During the fourth step of our validation process, looking at convergent validity, we also found that the ITQ and IPQ were correlated in most cases with the suggestibility inventory factors, and interestingly the ITQ involvement had a positive correlation with all the inventory factors and its total score. During this fourth step we also looked at correlations with the simulator sickness questionnaire, and what we found was that there are significant correlations with the ITQ involvement. And finally, in the fourth and final validation step, we looked at the relationship of ITQ and IPQ with the create questions. And what we found is that they all have significant correlations. However, the ITQ involvement only has positive correlations with immersion and engagement on the create questions. So in summary, we can say that we managed to validate the translation using 4 different approaches. First of all, the factorial validity, checking the internal factorial structure of the questionnaires themselves. And secondly, the internal consistency index using McDonald's Omega. Thirdly, the external validity, so the relationship between the IPQ and socio-demographic variables, gender and education, and the ITQ factors. And these 2 socio-demographic variables, gender and education. And finally, the convergent validity, the correlation between the IPQ and ITQ with other similar questionnaires, suggestibility inventory, the simulator sickness questionnaire, and the 4 create questions. In conclusion, VR has a vital role to play for assessments and interventions and training, and for this reason it's incredibly important that practitioners and researchers are able to measure, control and understand in the design and measurement of user experiences how the sense of presence and immersion are affecting the users and how their own tendencies to become immersed or feel present in a virtual or imaginary experiences influences their ability to perform or learn their task. Thank you so much for your attention. If you would like to download a copy of the translated IPQ and ITQ questionnaires, please take a screenshot of this QR code and you will be able to download them. And should you have any information or questions, you can address Professor Kandi at her email address and find her website at the University of Granada. And here is also a link for your information to the Center for Investigation of Mind, Brain and Behavior at the University of Granada. Thank you so much. Any questions, I'm happy to answer them.